Okay, today I'd like to talk about the Conservative Party leadership battle that is going on at the moment, and to help you use it the most effectively with the exam in mind. Of course, when you get to the exam, you want to have the most recent examples going on. You want to be able to write about certain things that are going on, and so you need to be focused on what is useful to you. And there are several reasons why this leadership battle is going to be useful. The Conservative Party is fascinating. It is very often in power. It wins elections, and in its recent history, it's been in a certain amount of turmoil. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this transpires. The reason this issue is going to be helpful is it tells us something about parties. You need to know something about particularly the two major parties in the UK, and you need to have a little bit of knowledge about them, their history, the factions within them are important. How leadership works in the British parties is potentially important. Each leader brings something different. Some are incredibly successful. Some get to be Prime Minister. Others don't. Others fall by the wayside, and even the Prime Ministers tend to fall spectacularly. It's a tough job. And there are also links to ideology as well. So there are bits of the specification that are linked together through this one story, and therefore it could form part of a case study that helps you with multiple questions when the exam comes around. Obviously, you should be taking a deep dive into UK politics, and this is an issue that you should be fully immersed in. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but there's just a quick look at the Conservatives right now in 2024. Let's see where they are at. I'm describing them as a divided and wounded party. They've just suffered a massive election defeat. Labour aren't necessarily doing a great job right now, and you'll see that in the news as well, but they are stable. They have enough seats in Parliament to be stable for the next 4.5 years before an election has to happen. So that is the context that the Conservative Party finds itself in. They've just lost an awful lot of seats. Despite winning a massive election in 2019, an 80-seat majority for Boris Johnson, and obviously no one could see COVID coming, which is part of the reason why there was turmoil. We could see Brexit coming, which is why he did so well. He promised to get Brexit done, and that's what people wanted. But it has been a lot of turmoil since then. We've had downfalls of Boris Johnson, particularly regarding scandals to do with COVID parties in Downing Street, and then of course he was forced out of office in the summer of 2022 by his own cabinet. Brutal, absolutely brutal. And then of course Liz Truss came along and only lasted a few weeks because of the calamitous budget with a Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng in the kind of autumn of 2022. Rishi Sunak was kind of appointed by the Parliamentary Conservative Party without asking the members after Truss had fallen. Of course, he had lost to her in the leadership election. So suddenly he was there, and Labour were well ahead of the Conservatives in the polls by the time Sunak came along, and I think it was really very little he could do, although it is worth pointing out that he didn't need to call the election in July this year. He could have waited. The economic situation is slightly better than it was, and he might not have lost so many seats. However, having the power as Prime Minister to call an election is a blessing and a curse. When do you do it? It's really hard, and I don't think he was particularly enjoying his time as Prime Minister. He looks like he's enjoying it more as Leader of the Opposition, knowing that he can step down from that role very soon. There's an article from earlier this year, in January 2024, from the BBC, naming 8 different factions within the Parliamentary Conservative Party, 8 different factions where MPs were coalescing around different ideas. That is large. That is difficult to manage if you are the leader of that party. How do you get all of those factions of people working together? How do you get people voting together? Very tough job. That gives us an indication of how of the position that the Conservatives are in. The job of the person who wins is to unite that party, and I think that's going to be hard, and then take on Labour, which is going to be hard, even though Labour are having difficulties. So this is what to look out for. We've got Robert Jenrick versus Kemi Badenoch. That is the two candidates that are now going to be voted for by members of the party. Tory MPs have whittled the contest down to these two people. The final part of this puzzle occurred a couple of weeks ago, where James Cleverly, who was also in this fight, his supporters got a bit too clever. And they decided that they didn't want to face Kemi Badenoch. So his supporters decided that some of them would vote for Jenrick instead. And this strategy backfired spectacularly, because they ended up voting so many of them for Jenrick that Cleverly was knocked out himself. Cleverly was closer to the centre of the party than these two. These two are on the right of the party, both of them. They are both from the same area, not necessarily the same exact faction in that number of 8, but they're from the same sort of area. So there's one big problem. Whoever wins out of these two, there is disunity in that party. The centre and the left of the party, what we would call the One Nation Conservatives, don't have a candidate. How do you get them involved? How do you unite that party? Do you give James Cleverly a role? Do you give your opponent a role? Do you let them go to the back benches where they might well be sniping behind your back because politics is so horrible? Who knows? Who knows how they do this? It's going to be difficult. They have to appeal to all factions, and yet they're both from the right. We also have to bear in mind, this is particularly important, that those two candidates are both moving towards a kind of Nigel Farage position. They're moving towards the sort of position that would attract reform voters. But we have to remember that while the Conservative Party lost a lot of votes to reform in the 2024 general election, they didn't lose many seats to them. They lost seats to Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And by drifting further to the right, they risk finding it very difficult to get those seats back. You win a parliamentary majority by winning seats, not votes. And that is a complex, dynamic thing that is interesting to look out for. So there are parallels here, I think, with 1997. Labour won a big majority that year. The Conservatives went rightwards with William Hague, and they lost in 2001. He was replaced by Ian Duncan Smith, and he never even faced an election because he was doing so badly. He was again on the right, and then they chose another person from the right in Michael Howard, who lost in 2005. And then in following that election, they finally picked on David Cameron, who was able to talk a more centrist position. He was still a Thatcherite, but he was able to talk in quite liberal tones, particularly on social issues. What we have at the moment is two candidates who are particularly socially conservative, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that all works out. In order to get the most out of this, you need to read. Make sure you use quality publications. Podcasts can be useful. Watch out if there are any debates between the two of them. Don't just watch the highlights, watch the whole thing. It's fun. Watch it live if you can. Work out what is good about these two people, what is not working from either of them. If you watch it in an edited form, someone's made those decisions for you. And then, of course, the result comes on the 2nd of November after party members have voted, and then there's even more to watch out for. But make notes of all of this as it's going on and think for yourself, what can either of these two people do to bring the fight to Keir Starmer? I've got a feeling that they are going to find it exceedingly difficult